Hey guys, tonight we slip into a world where shadows lean closer and the past insists on whispering into your ear. You're not just lying in bed anymore. You're sliding into the corridors of time where prophets muttered cryptic words and rulers squirmed on their thrones, wondering if the sky itself had turned against them. And let's be honest, you probably won't survive this journey if you try to fact-check every single prophecy while half asleep. So don't bother, just float with me. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a quick comment with your location and local time. There's something oddly cozy about seeing who else is drifting off with you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself walking through an ancient market where the air is thick with incense and gossip. At the far end, beneath an archway smeared with soot, a small woman in a faded robe leans over a bowl of oil. Her voice is rough, almost like gravel being stirred, and she mutters in a tongue you can't quite catch. Everyone around her is silent, as though waiting for the oil itself to tell them their fate. You stand there, pretending not to care, but your ears sharpen when she pauses and says, "The empire will crack like dry clay." You know she isn't talking about pottery. That image clings to you. The idea of prophecy being something so mundane, yet so terrifying. Scholars still argue whether these oracles were simply master psychologists reading micro-expressions and fears, or whether they tapped into some unseen current. But for you, standing in the crowd, it feels less like psychology and more like a dagger slipped under the ribs. You drift down an alley, the smell of bread and sweat mixing together, and you hear whispers about Delphi, the grand oracle, the one kings traveled weeks to consult. You can picture it. Marble steps worn smooth by sandals, and a priestess perched above a crack in the earth, her voice rolling like smoke. The mainstream historical fact here? Ancient Greeks actually built the Temple of Apollo at Delphi on top of a geological fissure that leaked ethylene gas. Modern science suggests the fumes may have caused trance-like states. You imagine yourself crouching closer, hearing her riddle-laced answers. She's not speaking to you directly, but somehow you know her words will knot themselves into your life anyway. A quirky little detail slides into your mind. People didn't always pay with gold. Some would offer honeycombs, fancy cheese, or even goats. Imagine being a prophetess, trying to keep a straight face while someone bribes the gods with dairy products. Yet the prophecies came, layered in mystery, and sometimes, shockingly, they turned out right. Your path twists again, and you're suddenly among Roman soldiers, their armor clinking like restless coins. They're tense. Everyone talks about the Sibyl's scrolls, those enigmatic volumes supposedly sold to Tarquin the Proud, last king of Rome. He didn't buy them all at first, too stingy, too skeptical. But as legend goes, the prophetess burned some and made the price the same for the rest. Eventually, he caved. You can picture him standing there, watching priceless knowledge go up in flames because he wanted a bargain. It's a scene you can almost smell. Smoke curling into the Roman air, regret baked into the king's face. You wander past them, and the crowd thickens. People want certainty in a world where thunder feels like divine rage, and an eclipse is the sky's way of saying, brace yourself. You realize that in this moment, you too want answers. Will you find peace tonight? Will tomorrow be kind? You glance at the woman with the bowl of oil again, half expecting her to nod in your direction. But instead her words echo, "Empires crack." Maybe she isn't just talking about Rome or Greece or Babylon. Maybe she's talking about you, about how your own worries split like brittle walls in your head. Prophecy isn't always about the far future. It's also about the quiet collapse you feel inside. You shuffle further along, the night wind brushing cool against your skin. You sense that you're on the edge of a labyrinth where every turn leads to another whisper, another chance that the impossible might just come true. And as you stand there, letting the darkness fold over you, you can't help but feel that the oracle has already seen you coming. You move forward into the hush of an ancient courtyard, where torchlight flickers against stone walls, and the air feels heavy, as if the night itself is holding its breath. The crowd murmurs about dreams, strange visions people claim to have before disasters strike. You're not sure whether to laugh it off or lean in closer, but something about the way their eyes widen makes you step quietly, listening. Someone whispers about a fisherman who dreamed of the sea boiling red just days before a volcanic eruption. You see it in your mind, waves hissing, fish floating belly up, the dreamer waking drenched in sweat. The odd thing? The eruption happened exactly where he worked. Coincidence? Scholars still argue whether dreams are just subconscious clutter or if they catch faint tremors of reality before it breaks. You picture yourself in a crowded medieval town square where gossip spreads faster than fire. A woman mutters that she dreamt the church steeple cracked in half, bells tumbling down. Everyone laughs at her until, weeks later, lightning strikes the tower, sending bells clanging into the cobblestones. You imagine the townsfolk staring at her afterward, their laughter suddenly stuck in their throats. The mainstream historical fact here is chilling. Before the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, multiple reports tell of people dreaming of buildings falling and streets splitting apart. Even animals were restless, howling through the night. It makes you wonder if the subconscious tunes into some hidden frequency, warning you in riddles while you sleep. A quirky detail slides into focus. In ancient Mesopotamia, dream interpreters actually kept clay tablets cataloging common visions: falling teeth, rivers flooding, snakes slithering into beds. Imagine some dusty librarian of dreams flipping through those records, telling a terrified villager, "Oh yes, that nightmare about snakes? Congratulations, it means you'll gain wealth." Comforting, right? You drift further and see yourself climbing narrow steps into a dim chamber where a pharaoh lies awake, his eyes wide in the lamplight. He too dreams. 7 fat cows devoured by 7 lean ones. You recognize the story. Joseph in the Bible, interpreting famine and plenty. The eerie part is how close it matches the rhythm of actual Nile floods. Scholars debate whether Joseph's tale reflects real weather cycles or just symbolic storytelling, but the weight of the dream lingers either way. The courtyard grows colder, and you suddenly feel the ground tilt beneath you. It's as though you're standing on the cusp of one of those moments people later claim they foresaw. You glance up at the stars, wondering if they know what's coming. The murmurs around you fade into the creak of your own heartbeat, steady, yet uneasy. Maybe you've had one of those nights yourself, the dream that sits like smoke in your chest all day, refusing to vanish. You tell yourself it's nothing, yet hours later, when the news flashes or something shifts, the dream's claws dig deeper. You can't prove it, but it's there. The woman with the cracked church dream, the fisherman with the boiling sea, the pharaoh with his gaunt cows, they're not so different from you. And as the torches sputter and the night deepens, you wonder, are dreams just echoes of fear? Or are they the faint handwriting of the future scrawled across your sleep? You slip into another corridor of time where the stone pillars of ancient Rome rise up around you like watchful giants. The air is thick with the smell of wax tablets and smoke from sacrificial fires. You hear the name whispered, the Sibyl's Scrolls. They're said to be locked away, guarded like treasure, words written in cryptic prophecy. You feel the pull, as if those scrolls aren't just parchment, but portals. The story unravels in your mind. A mysterious woman, known only as the Sibyl,
approaches King Tarquin with 9 scrolls of prophecy. She asks a price so high he scoffs, shakes his head, dismisses her like she's a street peddler. You picture her narrowing her eyes, then calmly burning 3 of the scrolls right in front of him. The flames dance, the smoke coils skyward, and suddenly Tarquin's smugness fades. He refuses again, and she burns 3 more. Only then does he pay the full price for the last 3. You can almost hear the silence of his court as he realizes the knowledge he carelessly let slip into ash. The mainstream historical fact? Roman tradition tells us these Sibylline books were later stored in the Temple of Jupiter, consulted in times of dire crisis. When Rome trembled, leaders turned to those cryptic words, desperate for guidance. You walk with them in your imagination, senators pacing the marble floor, hands clenched, waiting to hear whether the scrolls promised salvation or doom. But there's a quirky twist. Over time, the scrolls themselves vanished, destroyed in a fire, lost to history. Replacement versions were supposedly gathered from far corners of the world. Imagine the scene. Roman officials scouring Greece, Asia Minor, maybe even Egypt, begging for fragments of prophecy, piecing together riddles like a cosmic puzzle. It's almost laughable. World leaders scrambling not over weapons, but over cryptic poetry. You pause, hearing echoes of debate. Scholars still argue whether the Sibyl ever existed, or if the scrolls were simply political tools, cleverly written texts that could be bent to justify whatever the Senate wanted. You picture the smug grin of a Roman senator, unrolling the parchment, dramatically declaring, "The prophecy says we must raise taxes." Convenient, right? But there's something haunting about the idea of knowledge slipping through greedy fingers. You think of Tarquin again, watching 6 volumes of potential future reduced to cinders because he couldn't see their worth. Maybe you've done the same, ignored a warning, dismissed a hunch, only to regret it later when events prove you wrong. Prophecy or not, the sting feels familiar. As you wander through the forum, you can almost see fragments of the Sibyl's words floating like ashes in the air. A child plays with a wooden toy at the base of a column, and you wonder if her fate is too scribbled in lost scrolls. A breeze nudges your cheek, and it feels like a whisper reminding you, sometimes what you refuse to believe still finds a way to come true. The marble steps echo beneath your feet as you walk on, the night air wrapping tighter around you. The scrolls are gone, but their absence is almost louder than their presence, like a silence that insists on being heard. You tilt your head back, and the sky stretches wide, a canvas spattered with stars. For a moment, you think you can hear the soft scratching of quills as ancient astrologers chart the heavens, convinced that somewhere in the dance of constellations lies the script of human destiny. You drift into their world, where domes open to the night and candles burn low beside bronze instruments. You imagine yourself standing beside a Babylonian stargazer, his clay tablets spread out like puzzle pieces. He traces the path of Jupiter with a reed stylus, muttering predictions for kings and wars. The mainstream historical fact? As early as 1000 BCE, Mesopotamian scholars meticulously recorded planetary movements and tied them to political outcomes. To them, a comet wasn't just a rock, it was a cosmic memo from the gods. But of course, there's a quirky detail too. Some of these astrologers genuinely believed that if a goat sneezed under a crescent moon, it was an omen. Yes, goat sneezes. You can almost picture it, a priest solemnly nodding while the goat just wants to finish its dinner. You can't decide if you should laugh or shiver. As you wander further back, you notice Roman generals pacing under the same stars, consulting charts before battle. Scholars still argue whether their victories came from clever strategy or the comfort of believing the cosmos had their back. You see Caesar, perhaps, glancing skyward before crossing the Rubicon, telling himself the stars approved. You know the leap was political, but for him, celestial approval probably made it easier to sleep at night. You drift into Alexandria, where Greek scholars blend astronomy with philosophy. A man in a white robe insists that your birth hour ties you to planetary patterns that shape your character. You smirk. Maybe your stubborn streak was written in Saturn's orbit all along. The thought lingers. How much of what you call free will is really just you playing your role in a script the stars wrote long before you showed up? You feel a tug, a little unease, as if the constellations are rearranging themselves just for you. Maybe you felt it before, checking a horoscope half as a joke, only to find the words eerily relevant. You tell yourself it's coincidence, yet here you are, still thinking about it. The line between superstition and reality blurs when the night sky seems to lean closer. The astrologer beside you scratches one last note onto his tablet, then looks at you with eyes that seem to glint like Orion's belt. He doesn't say much, only murmurs, "The stars know." And suddenly, the silence above feels less like emptiness and more like a watchful audience, waiting for you to take your next step.
You step into a long hall draped with banners, their fabric heavy with dust and memory. At the far end sits a king, his crown tilted, his face pale. The air is thick with unease because word has spread. He's been warned. A prophecy hangs over him like a sword suspended by a single hair. You take a seat at the edge of the court, blending into the shadows, watching as whispers coil through the chamber. One tale clings strongest. Julius Caesar warned by a soothsayer to beware the Ides of March. You can almost see the scene, the bustling streets of Rome, Caesar brushing off the warning with a laugh, his toga trailing dust. The mainstream historical fact? On March 15, 44 BCE, Caesar was assassinated in the Senate. The soothsayer's words linger like an echo, the kind that only makes sense too late. But there are smaller, stranger stories too. You wander to medieval courts where jesters and prophets often shared the same space, one in bells and one in rags. A quirky detail slips through. In France, some kings actually employed royal dream interpreters on payroll. Imagine your entire job being to explain why the king dreamt of cheese rolling down a hill. You grin at the absurdity. Yet the seriousness with which it was taken makes you shiver. The hall grows colder as another vision unfolds. Alexander the Great, consulting oracles before charging into battle. He's told he's invincible, touched by gods. You watch him grin with dangerous certainty, convinced fate itself sharpened his sword. Scholars still argue whether Alexander believed these prophecies or cleverly used them to inspire his soldiers. Either way, his men followed, believing destiny rode beside them. The king before you fidgets. He's been told of betrayal, of downfall, of fire licking the walls of his kingdom. He waves it off, but his eyes betray him. You can feel his heartbeat in the silence of the court, heavy, unsteady. You wonder what's worse, knowing a warning and ignoring it, or never hearing it at all. You step closer, almost within reach of the throne, and you realize you're not just watching, you're part of the uneasy hush, a witness to how fragile power feels when prophecy curls around it. The king's hand trembles as he lifts his goblet, wine spilling down his robes. You know he'll pretend it's nothing, But you also know he won't sleep tonight.
You drift into a landscape of ruins where broken columns and shattered gates sprawl like the bones of forgotten giants. The air smells faintly of dust and iron, and though the silence is deep, you can almost hear the echo of crowds once filling these streets. Prophecies of collapse hang in the air, warnings that kingdoms would topple, empires would fall, and nothing built by human hands would stand forever. You picture Babylon, its walls towering so high they seem to touch the sky. People once said it was unbreachable, eternal. Yet stories of prophets, Daniel among them, whispered of its downfall. The mainstream historical fact? Babylon indeed fell in 539 BCE, conquered by Cyrus the Great, its vaunted defenses proving less than immortal. You imagine standing at the city gates the night it happened, torches flickering as the sound of Persian boots grew louder, fulfilling the whispered doom. A quirky detail sidles in. When Rome burned in 64 CE, some citizens swore they'd seen omens in the days before, flocks of ravens circling unnaturally, dogs howling without reason. Of course, animals howl all the time, but the timing etched itself into people's memories like a cosmic warning label. You grin at the thought of a poor raven just trying to find dinner, accidentally getting cast as a messenger of doom. You keep walking through toppled arches, and you hear the voice of Cassandra, the Trojan princess, cursed to foresee disaster but never be believed. You feel the ache of her warnings, ignored as the wooden horse was dragged inside the gates. Scholars still argue whether the myth of Cassandra grew out of actual seers at Troy, or if she's purely symbolic of every truth-teller brushed aside until it's too late. Either way, you feel her frustration press against you like a cold wind. The rubble crunches beneath your feet. You see Carthage in flames, Hannibal's city wiped from maps, once a rival to Rome, now reduced to ash. Prophets might have murmured of its fate, but no one stopped it. You think of how quickly glory slips into dust, how empires that thought themselves immortal became ghost stories for night wanderers like you. You glance over your shoulder, half expecting the stones themselves to whisper your own ending. And maybe that's the trick with prophecy, not just predicting history's grand collapses, but reminding you that nothing in your life, no matter how solid, is immune to the quiet crumble. The wind sighs through broken arches, almost like applause for the inevitability of endings. You tighten your cloak around your shoulders and walk on, knowing that the fall of empires is not just a story of kings and walls, it's the story of everyone who thought tomorrow was guaranteed. You step into a narrow alleyway where the air feels heavy, almost sour, and the streets are quieter than they should be. Windows are shuttered, doors bolted, and you can't shake the sense that something invisible prowls the darkness. Whispers gather around you, prophecies of pestilence, eerie predictions that warned people long before the sickness struck. You picture a medieval town square, a monk scribbling by candlelight. He writes of a great mortality that will sweep across Europe, a darkness carried on the breath of strangers. The mainstream historical fact? Chroniclers described strange omens before the Black Death in the 14th century. Comets blazing across the sky, livestock dying suddenly, and people dreaming of oceans turning black. You feel the tension of a world bracing for something it doesn't understand. A quirky detail sticks in your mind. Some villagers swore cats carried the plague, so they hunted them en masse. Ironically, fewer cats meant more rats, and more rats meant more fleas, and more fleas meant, well, you know how that ended. You can almost see a smug rat scurrying past your feet untouched as humans foolishly pat themselves on the back for their precaution. You slip deeper into the gloom and find yourself in Constantinople. Rumors swirl that seers predicted the Justinian plague, foretelling death that would roll through the city like fog. Scholars still argue whether those warnings were hindsight exaggerations or if people truly sensed what was coming.
You hear the coughing in the distance, the rattling of a cart carrying bodies, and suddenly, the prophecy feels less like superstition and more like a memory written in advance. Your steps echo in the silence. You think about how every pandemic, from ancient times to now, carried its own folklore of warnings, dreams, omens, whispered signs. Maybe it wasn't prophecy at all. Maybe it was just people looking for patterns in chaos. Yet you can't deny the chill that creeps down your spine as you picture villagers murmuring that the stars looked wrong, the moon hung heavy, and the air itself tasted sick. You reach the end of the alleyway where a single lantern sways in the wind. The flame flickers as if threatened by an unseen breath. And for a moment, you wonder if someone whispered a prophecy into your ear tonight about an illness no one could stop. Would you laugh it off, or would you start checking for shadows in your lungs?
You emerge into a vast plain where the horizon glows faintly red, as though the earth itself is smoldering beneath the surface. The air carries the scent of ash and iron, and every step you take seems to echo with the memory of marching boots. Whispers rise around you, prophecies of fire, of war, of visions that bled into reality. You imagine a Celtic druid staring into the flames, eyes glazed, voice trembling as he speaks of foreign ships on the coast, soldiers in gleaming armor. Centuries later, Romans do arrive, and suddenly the prophecy no longer sounds like the rambling of a mystic, but a replay of what had been foretold. The mainstream historical fact? Julius Caesar himself wrote of Gallic seers who claimed to foresee battles in dreams and omens. You can almost hear the clash of swords carried on the wind, as if time itself still remembers. A quirky detail breaks the heaviness. Some medieval armies actually paid fortune tellers to predict whether the battlefield mud would be ankle-deep or knee-deep. Imagine a hardened knight waiting nervously for a woman with bones and runes to tell him if he'd spend tomorrow drowning in muck. You chuckle, but the soldiers hung on every word, as though mud could decide the fate of empires. You drift further, and visions come sharper. A monk in Byzantium sketches stars streaking across the night sky, murmuring that it means fire will descend upon the city. Weeks later, a fire does sweep through wooden districts, the night sky glowing as if to prove him right. Scholars still argue whether those predictions were genuine foresight or carefully remembered coincidences, humans bending memory to make prophecy fit. Then your mind jolts to Nostradamus, the French seer whose verses hinted at cities burning and wars swallowing nations. You picture him scribbling in dim candlelight, words bent into riddles, easy to doubt, yet impossible to ignore when flames really did consume towns. You hear his voice in your head, vague, mysterious, almost teasing, like he knew that centuries later people would still squint at his words, wondering if the fire they saw was the fire he meant. The plain around you darkens, the glow deepens, and you realize you're standing in the middle of countless prophecies layered on top of each other. Warnings of siege, of torches flung over walls, of fields soaked not with rain, but with blood. The silence presses hard, broken only by the phantom crackle of flames. And just as you turn, you swear you hear a distant voice whisper in your ear, "The fire is always closer than you think." You blink, and the plain dissolves back into night, leaving only the uneasy warmth in your chest.
You wander into a narrow street, where lanterns swing lazily in the night breeze. The cobblestones gleam as though freshly washed by rain, but the hush that clings to this place feels older, heavier. Shadows peel away from doorways, and in them you catch glimpses of figures cloaked in rags, their eyes burning with something that is not quite madness, not quite sanity. These are the mystics in disguise, saints, fakirs, wanderers, people whose words were dismissed as riddles until the world bent itself around their predictions. You picture a Sufi dervish in the medieval Middle East, his hair wild, his cloak torn, standing in a bazaar while people laugh at his mutterings. Yet he whispers of cities swallowed by sandstorms, caravans lost, rulers falling ill. Years later, his words sound eerily precise. The mainstream historical fact? Accounts from travelers like Ibn Battuta mention holy men in deserts who were consulted for their uncanny visions. You feel yourself standing there too, the dry wind scratching at your face, the laughter of skeptics trailing into silence when events unfold exactly as foretold. A quirky detail slips into focus. In some European villages, locals believed certain beggars were actually disguised prophets. If you treated them kindly, you might receive a blessing or a cryptic prediction. Imagine nervously handing a stranger a loaf of bread, only for him to grin and mutter, "You'll see the river rise before your house does." You'd probably lose sleep every time clouds gathered. You wandered deeper, and the disguise shifts. A wandering monk in China scribbles predictions in the margins of poetry, warning that dynasties would crumble. Later generations pore over his verses like puzzle pieces, shocked at how neatly they seem to fit. Scholars still argue whether these mystics were truly foreseeing or simply brilliant observers of human weakness, their warnings sharpened by intuition more than divine insight. Yet the thought lingers. How often do you ignore the odd stranger muttering on the street corner, brushing them off as eccentric? And what if, hidden in their tangle of words, is the one phrase that would have changed your life had you listened? The lanterns sway harder now, the shadows stretching long. One of the cloaked figures passes you, and for a fleeting second you feel the brush of a hand against yours. A whisper curls into your ear, "Don't forget the river." You shiver, unsure whether it was a memory or a prophecy borrowed just for you. You step out onto a shoreline where the moonlight shivers across black water, and the salt wind tangles your breath. The sea feels alive, restless, as though it remembers every prophecy ever whispered into its waves. You hear the murmurs of sailors who swore the ocean carried warnings, visions of wrecks, storms, and cities lost beneath the tide. You picture a Greek harbor buzzing with the clatter of ropes and sails. A weathered fisherman tells you in a low voice that he dreamt of a wave taller than a temple. Days later, the island of Thera erupts, and the sea heaves itself against the land. The mainstream historical fact? The eruption of Thera around 1600 BCE likely inspired later legends of Atlantis, a city swallowed whole by the ocean. You stand there, feeling the ground tremble as though you've arrived just in time to see myth bleed into reality. A quirky detail tickles your mind. Medieval sailors often refused to set sail on Fridays, claiming the sea punished anyone who defied that superstition. Imagine an entire crew sulking on shore, glaring at the captain who dares them to risk Neptune's wrath. You almost laugh, but then you hear the roar of waves, and the humor dissolves into unease. You drift further and see Norse seers chanting about Ragnarok, the sea boiling, the serpent Jormungandr rising. For them, prophecy wasn't just about politics. It was cosmic doom tied to the tides. Scholars still argue whether such tales reflect memory of real floods and tempests in Scandinavia, or whether it was simply mythology built from the fear of drowning. Either way, the chill in your spine feels real. You kneel by the surf, the foam licking at your boots, and you think about all the ghost stories tied to water. Phantom ships seen before storms, glowing lights skimming the waves, voices heard beneath the foam. Were they omens, hallucinations, or the sea's own way of reminding humans how fragile they are? The tide surges higher, a spray stings your cheek, and you swear you hear a voice in the rush of waves. It's not a roar, it's a whisper, slippery and sly. The sea always takes back what it lends. You stand frozen, your heart thrumming with the rhythm of the tide, unsure whether you've just been warned or welcomed. You drift into a quiet meadow at dusk, where fireflies blink like faint sparks of prophecy themselves. A hush settles as children gather in a circle, their faces pale in the fading light. At first it looks like play, but then you realize these are child seers, their visions spilling out in words too heavy for such small voices. You picture ancient Greece, where a girl barely 10 years old is brought to a temple because she claims to see wars in her dreams. Adults scoff until armies actually march weeks later. The mainstream historical fact? The Pythia at Delphi, the famed oracle, was sometimes chosen while still in her youth, serving as a living bridge between mortals and Apollo. You imagine her trembling on the stone seat, words tumbling from her lips, while gray-haired priests scribble them down as gospel. A quirky detail brushes past you. In some villages, kids were believed to have clear sight only until they lost their baby teeth. Imagine a mother frantically writing down everything her toddler says about the sky or the river, just in case. You smirk at the thought, but the tension in her eyes feels real. You wander further and arrive at a medieval hamlet where a boy claims he sees a village in flames. People laugh, calling him dramatic, until a lightning storm sets the thatched roofs ablaze. Suddenly, he's no longer the silly boy. He's the one everyone fears to ignore. Scholars still argue whether children's visions were exaggerated folktales, or whether communities projected anxieties onto their young, hearing prophecy in every nightmare. The meadow darkens, and you kneel closer. A girl with tangled hair whispers, "Don't go near the river tomorrow." Her voice is flat, calm, almost too calm. You feel a strange pull to listen, though part of you wants to laugh it off. But when children speak with that kind of eerie certainty, it plants roots in your chest. You rise slowly, realizing these young seers weren't only telling stories. They were living reminders that truth sometimes comes from the least expected mouths, and ignoring them could cost more than you'd ever imagine. The fireflies swirl higher now, like sparks from a fire that hasn't started yet. And maybe that's the point. You tread softly into a dimly lit library, the air thick with the musk of parchment and the faint sweetness of beeswax candles. Rows of shelves rise around you like cathedral pillars, each stacked with brittle manuscripts bound in cracked leather. The silence here is deceptive. It feels less like absence of sound and more like a room holding its breath. You realize these aren't ordinary texts. These are manuscripts of prophecy,
hidden for centuries. You picture a monk in a cold stone scriptorium, quills scratching furiously as he records visions he swears came in dreams. He doesn't sign his name, too dangerous. Instead, the words are disguised as allegories about lions, rivers, or burning towers. The mainstream historical fact? Many medieval manuscripts preserved apocalyptic prophecies, often annotated in the margins by later readers who claim to see events like plagues or wars reflected in the cryptic lines. A quirky detail catches your eye. Some of these books were bound with metal clasps, as if to keep the knowledge inside from leaking out. Imagine believing words could be so powerful they might escape on their own if you didn't lock them down. You reach for a clasp and hesitate, half expecting the book to thrum like a living thing under your hand. You glance over one text from Persia, where scribes describe a ruler's downfall with uncanny precision. Another whispers about cities burning in the north, centuries before the Mongol invasions. Scholars still argue whether these manuscripts were truly predictive or carefully revised after events happened, retrofitting prophecy to match reality. But as you run your finger along faded ink, the neatness of the predictions unsettles you. Too clean, too sharp. Then, faintly, you notice something unsettling. A few lines are crossed out, not once, but several times, as if some later reader tried desperately to hide them. The ink grows darker there, the parchment thinner. You lean closer, and the words shimmer under your gaze like they don't want to be read. The letters seem to say, "You are already part of this story." The candle nearest you sputters. You close the manuscript quickly, heart racing, because suddenly the silence doesn't feel like waiting anymore. It feels like listening. You step into a bustling courtyard where banners snap in the wind and trumpets blare in sharp metallic notes. Kings and queens sit high on thrones, their crowns glinting beneath a restless sun. The air is thick with incense and tension, for this is the stage of royal prophecies, visions that shaped crowns, wars, and the rise and fall of dynasties. You picture a French court, a seer bowing low as he mutters that a young prince will one day split the kingdom in two. Nobles laugh nervously, but decades later, civil war shreds the land. The mainstream historical fact? Nostradamus served at the French court, his cryptic quatrains eagerly devoured by royalty who feared hidden warnings in every line. You imagine a queen clutching one of his books, her knuckles white, searching for comfort, and instead finding only dread. A quirky detail flickers into your mind. In some medieval courts, jesters, yes, the clowns in motley clothes, were rumored to deliver prophecies hidden inside their jokes. Picture a king roaring with laughter while secretly sweating over whether the punchline about his downfall was just a gag or something darker. You can't help but smirk at the absurdity, though the smirk fades when you realize rulers often acted on these whispers. You drift further into another hall, this time the Tudor court in England. A woman lays cards on the table, hinting at betrayal and a beheading. The courtiers hush, staring sideways at Anne Boleyn. Scholars still argue whether such fortune-telling truly influenced decisions, or if later writers simply wove prophecies into the drama to make history more theatrical. But the image of Anne smoothing her dress while hearing hints of her fate feels chillingly vivid. The courtyard grows louder, drums rolling, and you notice something. The rulers looked less like masters of their fate and more like prisoners of words. Every decision, every campaign, tinged with the weight of what someone had once predicted. You lean closer, and a court astrologer raises his eyes to meet yours. He doesn't speak, but his look says everything. The crown is lighter than prophecy's shadow. You turn away, shivering,
realizing that power never shielded anyone from dread. If anything, it made prophecy heavier, sharper, and more impossible to ignore. You step into a smoky tavern, its rafters low and beams dripping with candle soot. The air thrums with murmurs, mugs clinking against rough wooden tables, and the sour sweet scent of ale. Here, prophecies don't come from gilded thrones or marble temples. They spill out of drunks, gamblers, and common folk whose voices are usually ignored until the future proves them right. You imagine a peasant leaning too close across the table, his eyes watery, whispering that the harvest will fail. Laughter erupts, mugs slam, and someone tells him to drink less. Months later, the fields lie blackened from blight. The mainstream historical fact? Records from medieval chronicles often note how simple folk or village madmen predicted disasters. Their warnings later folded into religious interpretations of famine or plague. You sip the bitter taste of dread with the ale, and it goes down harder than you expect. A quirky detail comes alive. Some taverns hired local prophet singers who wove gossip, omens, and drunken predictions into bawdy songs. Imagine half the room roaring with laughter at a lyric about a bishop falling in the mud, only for that bishop to die suddenly a week later. The laughter would stick in your throat after that. You wander to another corner where a dice game rattles. One man freezes mid-throw, claiming he saw flames in the pips, a sign that the city will burn. The others jeer, but a year later, fire guts half the district. Scholars still argue whether these tales of tavern prophecy are embellishments added after the fact, or whether ordinary people truly had moments of uncanny clarity in their drunken stupor. The tavern grows louder, voices rising, shadows flickering like restless omens. You lean against the bar, half expecting the barkeep himself to lean in and mutter something about your own fate. And when he does, his voice gravelly, his breath hot with ale, you feel the words etch themselves into your bones. Don't look for tomorrow in the bottom of a cup. It's already waiting outside the door. You stumble back, mug forgotten, because suddenly the laughter feels brittle, and the tavern's warmth has turned into something else entirely. A gathering place for warnings no one wants to believe until it's far too late. You wander into a dim stone chamber, colder than any place you've stepped before. The torches gutter along the walls, their flames bowing toward you as though pulled by some unseen current. At the center lies a table, strewn with relics, bones, coins, shattered idols, all said to have carried prophecies through generations. This is where whispers become immortal, stored not in voices, but in artifacts. You pick up a cracked tablet, its etchings almost erased, yet you can still trace the grooves where someone once carved warnings of floods and wandering stars. The mainstream historical fact? Babylonian astronomer priests recorded eclipses and linked them to royal fates, their clay tablets surviving thousands of years. You feel the cool grit of clay under your fingertips, like holding a fragment of the future that someone long ago thought important enough to preserve. A quirky detail catches your eye. Some relics weren't objects at all, but food. In medieval Europe, loaves of bread were sometimes baked with strange patterns or cracks that people swore foretold local misfortunes. Imagine staring at your dinner roll, half hungry and half terrified it's warning you about your neighbor's untimely death. You almost chuckle, but the bread's silence feels heavy. Your gaze drifts to relics tied to pilgrimages, a saint's finger bone said to tremble before a disaster, a chalice that clouded when wars loomed. Scholars still argue whether relics truly reacted, or whether human fear projected omens onto them. Either way, the faith people poured into these objects kept prophecies alive long after their seers were dust. As you stand in that chamber, you notice one more relic, something that doesn't belong. It looks new, almost too new. A shard of glass, reflecting your face back at you. The reflection wavers, not quite aligned with your own movements. Then, for a split second, you hear it, your own voice whispering a prophecy you haven't spoken yet. The torches flare, the relics shiver, and you suddenly understand why people clung to these objects, not because they were right, but because they made the future feel close enough to touch, terrifying, irresistible, and impossible to look away from.